I'd like to welcome all the guests here in person and those people online. We are absolutely thrilled with the level of interest for this event this evening, perhaps demonstrating how important this topic is. We have over 500 registrations in person and online. Yeah. And as I look out in the audience, I can see some people, and this lecture is their first Woodcock lecture, and I can see some people who have been to many more. In fact, there are one or two people here that have probably been to about 24 Woodcock lectures. So I'd like to extend a special invitation to some of the important members of our Wellways community who are with us tonight. We are honoured to have some people that have travelled from interstate here. Carolyn Nikolowski, the CEO of Mental Health Australia. Tim Heffernan, Chair of Being and New South Wales Deputy Mental Health Commissioner. Anna Gould and Andrew Johnson, the co-chairs of our Consumer and Carer Council associated with the Frankston Local. Long-time Wellways supporter, Evan Bashara, and Theo Crambius, one of our supporters. We are also delighted to welcome Wellways board members here and members of our Lived and Living Experience Authority who are here this evening. Now, I'd like to do a bit of housekeeping. This is an Auslan interpreted event, and it's also going to be streamed online. I'd like to acknowledge that this conversation may cause big emotions, and I'd like to let you know that the supports we have available. For those of you who are here tonight in person, we have a quiet space and a sensory room available with in-person peer support should you wish. Any Wellways staff member who have a lanyard will guide you to that spot, or head to the reception desk and they can help you as well. For those online supports are available via the links that are being provided at the moment. Wellways Listen Well, our warm line peer support service, is also operating until 9 o'clock this evening. For those persons here and online, Listen Well can be called at any time during the event, and as I said, up until about 9. The number is in the chat right now for those online and on the event agenda for those in person. Gender-neutral toilets are located back out in the foyer where you entered. And in the event of an emergency, calmly follow the directions of the Wellways staff or Wheeler Centre staff or those announced over the loudspeaker. The external assembly area is just outside on Little Lonsdale Street. And please, can you pop your mobile phones on silent? So, with that housekeeping done, I would like to turn our attention to what will be happening tonight at this, our 24th Woodcock lecture. We have a packed agenda. We have a wonderful keynote speaker, Giancarlo De Veris, and a subsequent panel discussion with Maria Katsonis and Associate Professor Harry Hill. And the discussion will be facilitated by Wellways' new Lived and Living Experience Director, Mary O'Hagan. But before we really get started, it's important that we acknowledge that we're here during National Reconciliation Week. The theme this year is Bridging Now to Next. Captures something very important. Reconciliation is not a straight line, but an ongoing process that is shaped by truth-telling, accountability, and real action from all Australians, especially of those of us who are not Indigenous. And with that commitment in mind, I'd like to invite Annette up to the stage for Welcome to Country. Thank you, Auntie.
Thank you for taking the time to do the Welcome to Country. The most important part about a Welcome to Country is recognising it once was Aboriginal land, but now it's our land. And when you accept that responsibility of becoming part of my extended family, it then becomes your responsibility to look after the land and the people on the land. And that's what we're here for tonight. And the sad thing about it is mental health doesn't discriminate. It hits all walks and changes of life. And I honestly believe that, we can't have solos everywhere with different nationality, Indigenous and non-Indigenous. It's a task we have to take on as a holistic approach. And I find where it seems to fall down the most, and it's the poor old GPs, but they're there for health, and the first point of call for someone with mental... And the reason I'm talking so much is I work with Headspace, and I try and change their outlook on a lot of things. And as an Aboriginal person, I was talking to them one day, and I'm an elder, and all the kids I know are 40 and 30 years old. And I was sitting there, and we're in there, and I'm talking about the problems with the kids and all that, and they didn't really understand me. It was a bit of a culture gap. But anyway, I ended up getting extra funding for the kids that we didn't even service. But, I thought that was excellent. My misunderstanding and your misunderstanding of what I meant by the kids, because we got a lot of kids that have got mental health, you've got to watch these words these days, eh? And most of them are drug affected. And we've got Sorry Week this week, and Sorry Week's about recognising stolen children. And when I talk about the stolen children on Monday, I said, hey, what a lot of people don't realise, prior to 1980, all children, all women that were underage with a child and had no one to look after it, their children were taken. It didn't discriminate against sex. But what did discriminate against sex was women. Prior to the early days in the 1960s, women weren't allowed to drink in pubs, Aboriginal people weren't allowed to drink in pubs, women weren't allowed to vote. Aboriginal people weren't allowed to vote. All the atrocities that happened to Aboriginal people were happening to women. And my wish is one day that non-Indigenous people whose children were taken before, we're getting pretty old now, eh? But they have the courage to stand up and say, my child was stolen too, where is it? Find it, because that kid, if you don't look for it and it finds out, it will be looking for you. So, if you pass the word out there, stolen children. But the problem is with our stolen children, and I really, really pray that it didn't happen to you, but our children were molested in the sex trade, belted and abused. And also in the 60s, it was quite reasonable. In the 70s, when I went to school, I got flogged by the teacher. When I went home, I got flogged by my mother. And it was a way of life impressed on us to make us be good. But what it did, it had an adverse effect, and I think that's where a lot of this mental problem stems from, was the abuse that happened, especially in our age, to the children. And what they do is they use drugs as an escape valve to get away from it. And it's not the answer, because when they come down from the drugs, they can't handle what they've done to the drugs, which contributes more. And especially with that really, really dangerous drug, ice, we've got so many kids now that have, not kids, young adults, who've experimented with the ice, and they're cooked. And I took one to a doctor once. It was my niece, and she was sitting there telling the doctor, she didn't know what I was on about. She said there was termites in the shed eating the wood away. And they released her after I had her sort of analysed. And I turned around and said to the person, do you realise the shed she was in was metal? It wasn't wood. There couldn't have been termites. So there's all these other little problems too when you're talking about humanity, human rights. they're not treated, and a lot of people that are treating these people with problems don't realise. And the worst part about it is they're ashamed. You know, it's pretty hard to say you got mental problems, isn't it? You know, I went through a little bit of a patch when I was the chair of Watherong Aboriginal Co-op. I had to do and see some things that I never wanted to see or do again. But that had a very bad mental effect on me. And first thing I did was hit the drink. And my kids, because I'm a single mum, my partner died when my children were 5 and 3. And they said, "Hey, Mum," and that was enough to pull me out of it. But a lot of people haven't got anything to pull them out of it. And I think it's the drugs and the alcohol that sometimes creates, or majority of the time, creates the mental health. And until we address the issue of why are they in trouble, and we get to the bottom of it, you'll never heal it. But I worked with a gentleman who had drug problems and mental problems, and it took me to 60. I run an archaeological company, and I employ people straight out of jail, straight off of drugs. And when they muck up again, I sack them so they can get legal aid. Because if they're employed, they can't get that. And I have how long it takes. And you never lose respect for those people. And I find the most thing I've got to do is tell them that I love them. And it doesn't matter what they've done in the past. It doesn't take away from who they are. And they're still very special. And that's the most important message I wanted to get around today. But if we're talking about human rights and we're talking about respecting them, we have to build that within them for them to be able to step forward. So I reckon you're on the right track, and good on yous. I really do, because it's a way forward, respect and dignity for these people, because they are people, and what they've been subjected to, a lot of them, shouldn't determine how they're structured or treated within society, whether they're a thief, a prostitute, you know, like, aren't we capitalists? Aren't we saying deliver a service for fees? You know, when you look down at the basics and the common denominator, like with the stolen children and that. So reconciliation is a very important part about us walking together. But when we're walking together, the people we're helping, they're walking beside us, not in front of us and not behind us. But having the opportunity to talk to you today, I couldn't help giving a little bit of a black history with the welcome to country. So good on yous, you know. And today, when I hop down, please don't clap me. Clap yous for caring, because you're the ones who are going to make a difference. And yous are the ones, if you fight hard, will teach these people how to respect themselves and love themselves so they can take that extra step forward. And a lot of them do these days need those drugs to balance their brains. So, you know, that's pretty cool to take drugs if it's for the right reason. And it's pretty cool to have a drink if you're just having a drink to be social. But if you've got a problem, you start drinking, don't. Anyway, I'm here to do the welcome to country. And in the beginning, we all believe in a creator. Some people call him God, some people call him Allah. But we all believe that God created us from the land. And if you don't believe in that, you believe in evolution, that we're created from microorganisms. We split into cells and then evolved into fish, and we're here today. And my son's an evolutionist. He's a beautiful kid. He's on the cusp of autism. And having an autistic kid is just so special. Like, I took him for a health check, and he turned around and he said to the doctor said to him, "Do you drink?" And he goes, "Yes." I go, "Shit." And the doctor said, "Do you drink regularly?" He goes, "Yes." And I go, "Joe, who's been giving you the alcohol, son?" He said, "Mum, when you take me to church on Sunday, that priest, I'm telling you, it's not blood." I cracked up laughing too, so to the doctor, but for a moment I panicked. But anyway, like when you get the common goal going, that we all believe in the same thing. We all believe we come from the land, you know. You cut us, we all bleed blood, you know. And that's the thing we've got to always look at, is the common goal. And remember, when you take a black fella out of the group, and if it's drug problems or that, he's going to go back and play with a non-Indigenous person or hang with a non-Indigenous person. You got to look at the whole community, not just pick out race, colour or culture. And I was doing this talk once in Castlemaine, and this gentleman got up and goes, "I respect your beliefs." He said, "I respect your dream time." He said, "But I believe in Adam and Eve, and I believe they're white." I said, "Really?" I said, "Well, weren't they from the Middle East, sir?" And he said, "Yes." And I said, "Well, wouldn't they have had a nice colour, at least olive?" And I said, in the Middle East, there was no such thing as apples. They were all eating pomegranates and figs. And I said, "Hang on, no, he was right, because if Adam and Eve had been black, they would have said stuff the apple and ate the snake." So we wouldn't end up in the proverbial room today, and you wouldn't be doing what you're doing, because we're living in purgatory. But anyway, Wirramjika, Naam, and I always remember Naam because I think of Indian bread, Naam. Wirramjika Naam, welcome to my country, and thank you for caring.
Thank you, Auntie Annette. I would now like to introduce Michael Gorton, our board chair, who will give the opening address. Michael.
Thanks, Laura, and thank you, Annette, for, I think, one of the most entertaining welcomes to country I think I've seen for a while. It's just fantastic. And thank you for weaving our issues into the welcome for this evening as well. It's been fantastic. And I also acknowledge the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people, the lands of which we meet, and pay my respects, and on behalf of you, your respects to elders past, present and emerging. I'm Michael Gordon, the chair of the board, and it's my privilege to open tonight's proceedings, the Woodcock Lecture, an event that is designed to challenge, to create, to talk about mental health, dignity, systems, processes, anything that touches upon that work. And as we do at Wellways, we also have an acknowledgement of people with lived and living experience. Because we recognise the enrichment to our organisation that people with lived and living experience bring. And of course we think, the first organisation to deliberately include a lived and living experience authority within our governance of our organisation, which sits equal with the board of the organisation to ensure that the voice of lived and living experience is in everything that we do. And so for the members of the authority who are here, we're grateful to have your contribution to Wellways recognised from our acknowledgement, which is, at Wellways we recognise people in our communities with lived experience of mental health and those who support and walk alongside them. We acknowledge that everyone's journey is unique and valued. We recognise their strength and courage. We respect and value their generous contributions, which teach us and guide us to continually shape, reflect upon and improve our work. It's great to be back at a Woodcock Lecture, which is a landmark event for Wellways. And it started with the generosity of a particular donor to our organisation, a contributor to our organisation. Frank Woodcock approached us in 1999 with a vision to challenge the stigma and discrimination surrounding mental health challenges, to generate and inspire action from organisations to help those most in need. And it's with that generosity that we were able to hold the first lecture in 1999 all the way through to today's lecture, and to ensure that we have a method of looking at an academic discourse about mental health, but also a very practical view of mental health, the issues and solutions and ideas. And so it's thanks to that generosity that we've had 24 lectures to date, as Laura mentioned, and that it has fostered great connections of Wellways with other parts of our community. So on to tonight's lecture, and across Australia online, conversations about mental health have never been more prominent, yet the gap between our aspirations and the human rights-led system that we are seeking is distant from the reality experienced by many who remain troubled with mental health issues. Too often our systems, despite good intentions, fall short of truly centring the dignity and humanity of those for which we serve. And tonight's focus on human rights-based approaches isn't simply an academic theory. It's intended to be about agency of every person seeking help and finding solutions to many of the issues that we face. We're honoured to have with us tonight Giancarlo De Vera, whose work as CEO of Being and their continued advocacy for LGBTQIA+ people and disability inclusion brings both lived experience and policy expertise to our discussions, and we're delighted to have Giancarlo with us this evening. His leadership in bringing communities together and challenging systems and bringing great insights to complex questions is well recognised. Joining our panel discussion, we have Maria Katsonis, and we're delighted to have Maria with us, who has for 2 decades in the Victorian Public Service had policy expertise, design, combined with her own lived experience, bringing a unique perspective into how transformation happens within government systems, and that's not always easy. And critically, how it might unfold differently when we genuinely place lived experience at the centre of what is being done. We're also joined by Associate Professor Harry Hill, whose clinical experience and work with the new Victorian mental health and wellbeing locals, some of which are being delivered by Wellways, offers practical insights into how we can shift entrenched system norms at the ground level where care actually happens. And the questions we're exploring tonight aren't comfortable ones. Why do our current systems so often fail to centre dignity? What structural barriers prevent us from implementing truly rights-based approaches? And perhaps most importantly, how do we move from aspiration to action? These challenges require us to examine not just policies and procedures, but also the assumptions and the interpretations that underpin how we think about mental health and think about recovery and what it truly means to support someone in distress. So tonight's discussion is being facilitated by Mary O'Hagan, who many of you will remember from her more recent government role as part of the mental health reforms, but who has, we're grateful for it, joined us to take on a very aspirational role within our organisation to connect lived experience into all of our services in relation to the work that we do and in relation to how we go about doing it. So we're grateful to have Mary as part of that, but Mary will be facilitating tonight's discussions with our guest speakers. And so as we move through the program, I encourage you to think about what you're hearing, how it might affect the work that you do or the contribution you might make in your various spheres of influence. Because as we know, mental health will always take a back burner unless we keep pushing it forward. Transformation doesn't just happen through a policy change, as we're fast seeing. It has to happen through each of us committing to approaching mental health support with greater humanity, respect and recognition of rights. So we're grateful to our speakers, grateful to the organisers who have got us to this point today, and certainly again thank and acknowledge the generosity of Frank and the Woodcock family who have made these lectures possible. So enjoy this evening. I'm not sure that's the right word. Hopefully we'll feel a little bit uncomfortable at times as well, but hopefully will lead to some change of thought and ultimately some change of actions. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Now we're going to move on to the main event, if you like. Giancarlo, I'd like to invite you to the stage and welcome you for the keynote presentation.
Woman Jekka, thank you for that acknowledgement. And that welcome to country, Auntie Annette. I too would like to begin by firstly acknowledging country. I want to say kamusta in my language, which is welcome. I want to pay my respects to the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, to elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to pay homage to the fact that I have First Nations heritage from the Philippines myself, and to where I'm from, this place called Lingayen, which in the language local to that place means to look back. And so, when I acknowledge country, I also ask us all to look back on the stories that brought us here tonight, the migrant struggles of my family, the resilience of First Nations people, particularly this week, and the quiet violence of a mental health system that denies dignity. We come here because we know stories from voices who have paved a way forward against huge opposition and resistance. Voices like my chair, Tim Heffernan, who I can just see over there, who many of you would know, and as Laura said, is the outgoing lived experience deputy commissioner of the New South Wales Mental Health Commission, and is here supporting tonight. I want to thank you. And stories that also remain unseen, unheard, stories that are held in the trauma of families, my family, of loved ones, and in memory. These stories, our voices, are why we must act. Our voices are brave, they are bold, they are beautiful. Our voices are getting louder, and we are a force to be reckoned with. Now, before I begin my lecture tonight, I'd also like to express my deep thanks to Wellways for bestowing this great honour for delivering the 2025 Wellways lecture. I can't believe it was 1999. I know I was worried about Y2K and in year 6. So here I am, not worried about Y2K, but instead I'm here to argue that Australia's mental health system fails not from a lack of potential, but from a lack of dignity. A refusal to see people with lived experience as architects of our own lives. I know this because I am one of those people. For those who don't know me, my name is Giancarlo De Vera. I'm a proud, queer, disabled, non-binary person of colour who has thrived despite being a victim survivor of child sexual abuse, a survivor of domestic violence, and a victim of coercive and involuntary treatment. These experiences do not define me, but they do colour my past, my present, and my future. They bestow gifts and curses, but as custodian of the meaning of these experiences, I choose when those experiences have power over me. That is my right, but I recognise that adversity still holds sway over people's past, present, and future. Too many are denied this right. I know, and I have lost people that I love, that have been denied being custodians of their own life's meaning. And so tonight, I want to speak plainly. Australia's mental health system does not suffer from a lack of potential. People with lived experience hold the key to change. It suffers from a lack of dignity that respects that people with lived experience hold that key to change. So let me be clear from the outset. Change is not only possible, it is necessary. But it must be led by those with lived experience. We are not passive recipients of care. We are agents. We have agency. We are agents of reform. We are agents of change. But we need to be valued and respected as architects of our own lives, our lives worth living. This shift in thinking has been promised for decades, yet its fruits remain barren. So my speech tonight is a call for people with lived experience to become custodians of your own life's meaning. A call for allies to redistribute power, ensuring that we lead the change that shapes our lives. The time is now for those with power to step back so we can step forward together. I am one of many who have made this call. For some, however, this call is too late. And so I want to invite you to share a moment of silence to those who remain unseen, unheard, ungrieved. That silence was for the quiet violence of our mental health system, the kind of violence that happens every day against unseen people. Unseen people like my brother, Christian De Vera, indefinitely detained as a forensic patient, denied a forensic bed in a forensic hospital while his rights are abrogated and his youth withers away. Unseen people like Kiri Diamond, my childhood best friend, who took her own life after similarly surviving child sexual abuse before she even became an adult. She was denied everything. Names like Christian and Kiri don't make headlines. They are scribbled in coronal reports, hospital and jail notes, and as footnotes of government reviews. These stories are emblematic of a broader, preventable problem. According to the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare, at least 1 in 2 people in prison have a mental health challenge, while suicide remains to be the leading cause of death for women aged 18 to 24, and might I add also men that at the same age. But lastly, that silence was also for the silence of allies. Those who in the face of injustice said nothing, whether through unawareness or unwillingness. Their inaction allowed systems to stay the same. It is silence that sustains harm. Silence too is a choice, and silence too leaves a mark. Names like mine, Christian and Kiri's tell a story of much needed change not realised. They are stories of indictment. Change hasn't come in the way that matters. Yet, yes, some reforms have been attempted, but they remain piecemeal, failing to dismantle the underlying structures of coercion and control. The reason? Simple and devastating. Governments only act when government sees violence as spectacular, when it's theatrical, and public, and when it becomes a crisis on first page of the newspaper. Too often, governments are reactive, responding only when violence is visible, public, and impossible to ignore, driven by the politics of crisis. Now, I'm new as a CEO being the state peak body for mental health, and in the entire time of being CEO, I've been at the centre of crisis-driven politics, following the ongoing mass resignations of psychiatrists in New South Wales. But what about the slow violence, the invisible violence? The slow violence of routine coercion remains unchecked. If change had come, Christian could have been supported, not incarcerated. Kiri could be alive, here in the audience, right over there tonight, not living in my memory. I would have received care in my 20s, not involuntary treated. The change would see people like me, Christian and Kiri as humans, not as objects of risk culture, of best interests, or in need of protection, but as humans with agency to be architects of lives worth living. As disability scholar Rose McGarland-Thompson reminds us, systems reveal their true values, not in their exceptions, but in their routines. So what does the routine reveal about the values of our mental health system? It reveals a system where coercion is standard and consent is optional. It reveals a culture where responding to distress with force is not an aberration, it's a policy setting, it's a budget line, it's a care plan. It reveals practices that will be considered unacceptable in any other part of the health system, but are justified under the name of protection, best interests, or medical necessity, or for the safety of the community. While not universal, these practices are all too common. They speak to an institutional culture that privileges control over care. All too often, what passes for as care in Australia, where dignity is absent, is the sound of restraints clicking into place as a person in distress is pinned down by the hands of strangers. It's the metallic clang of a hospital bed frame as somebody's body becomes a site of control instead of comfort. It's the chemical koshing of emotion and protest through forced medication administered not with empathy, but with indifference. It's the erasure of voice when treatment is imposed rather than chosen, and refusal is framed as a symptom and not a right. It's the $1,000 price tag for the privilege, so-called privilege, of being stripped of agency. And it's the documentation that sanitizes it all, where trauma is reworded as non-compliance and coercion is reframed as de-escalation. The power of this system does not reside in those of us who use it. It resides in institutions that decides who supports and who is controlled. It resides in policies that define risk without context, in laws that override will and preference, and in norms that interpret difference as danger. As the critical theorist Helen McCusker from the University of New South Wales reminds us, disability is not an individual flaw. It is produced by environments, systems, and structures that exclude, control, and erase. In our mental health system, diagnosis isn't always a gateway to support. Too often, it can be used as a label to categorise, to contain, to justify withdrawal of rights. We do not ask, why is there coercion? We ask, how much coercion is permissible? We do not interrogate whether people are distressed because of social abandonment, systemic neglect, or trauma. We convert pain and protest through pathologisation. We turn suffering into a problem to be managed. These tools of power, diagnosis, treatment orders, institutional language are not neutral, they are regulatory. They manage not only bodies, but meaning. They govern who gets to speak, who gets believed, who gets help, and who gets handled. This is not only a clinical or moral failure, it is a failure of our imagination, our laws, and our belief in our shared human dignity. Because if we believe that people with lived experience were full humans, fully capable, we would not build systems that strip us of our right to choose, to refuse, and to lead. So, how do we build a system that starts with dignity and humanity? First, I want to acknowledge that we are not starting from zero. We don't need another inquiry. We really, really don't. We don't need another roadmap or strategy. We need action. As I said from the outset, change is possible, but it's only possible if we share the belief that those with lived experience can be architects of our lives. We are the agents of reform who can create systems where we can be the architects of lives worth living. To do this, people with lived experience must lead co-design, not as a buzzword, but as a structural requirement. Co-design centres and intrinsically values lived experience leadership. It sees us as being first among equals. But this change also requires material investment in lived experience leadership. This investment is needed now, more perhaps than ever, as all Australian governments move towards providing community mental health supports for those unable to access the NDIS. This investment in lived experience leadership should be front and centre. This change also mandates peer-led bodies and institutions with real powers, not just some advisory group with no teeth. This change would incorporate the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities into Australian laws meaningfully by abolishing forced treatment and ensuring supported decision-making becomes a norm, not the exception. It would enshrine dignity legally, culturally, and institutionally. This is a blueprint for dignity, not as a dream, but as a demand. And this future is not out of reach. In fact, it's already unfolding. This future does not need to wait. This is not some distant future. The future is now. The change is already here. It is in the peer worker who stands with someone in crisis instead of calling police and emergency services. It is in the lawyer who challenges the forced treatment order. It is in the mother who supports decision-making with love, not control. It is in the advocate who supports someone who advocates for accessing services. It is in the nurse and the psychiatrist who refuses to coerce. These glimpses of hope of change are not outliers. They are proof of what's possible. But to make them the norm, we need 5 key changes. A truly human rights-based system starts, I'm going to say this, but it seems like a radical idea, but it starts with the belief that people with lived experience are not problems to be solved. We are reformers, leaders, visionaries. That means service changes that diverts resources away from all models that rely on or involve coercion, funding peer-led and community-based models of care that prioritises connection, choice and cultural safety, and resources peer workforces as core infrastructure in all settings where people experience mental health challenges. That means cultural change that embeds trauma-informed, rights-based and recovery-oriented practices that values our choices, including our right to refuse, and values our dignity to learn from our own mistakes. That means attitudinal change that values difference and accommodates human variation and diversity, and views us not as less than, but as people with strength, so we can discover ways for our diagnoses to no longer be tools of power, but as part of our individual stories of flourishing and as part of the rich tapestry of the human condition. That means institutional change that establishes and invests power in those with lived experience to oversee reforms and changes, and establishing peer-led bodies with investigatory and enforcement powers to drive service design, oversight, evaluation, and refinement. And lastly, that means legislative changes. Now, as a lawyer, I save the best for last, but these changes means repealing mental health laws that allow state-sanctioned violence through involuntary treatment, replaces coercive models, and embeds and respects our legal capacity to make decisions about our lives, our models of care, and our right to live and participate in the community. If we enshrine dignity across these domains, we can uphold the promise of potential. The potential for a world where Christian and Kiri are here in the room with me right now. The potential for a world where I did not spend half of my life searching for the support that I needed. The potential for a world where every human can be architects of lives worth living. And so as I conclude, I'm reminded of the words of the great, one of my favourites actually, disability rights activist Patricia Deegan. She once said, "They told me I would never recover, but what they meant was that they would never change." Change is not something we need to ask permission for. It is something we must demand, seize, lead. The question, however, is whether we as a nation will finally see the real emergency that's been here all along. Not the emergency of a mental health system in crisis, but the emergency of a system that confuses control with care, that mistakes compliance for recovery, and would rather invest in beds and not lived experience leadership. The time is now for those with power to surrender. So to those who hold power, I ask, will you surrender it? Or will you stand on the wrong side of history? Look back, see the violence, then act, not as allies who grant power, but as accomplices who redistribute it. The time for change isn't coming, it's here. And it begins with you and I.
Thank you so much for a rather stirring delivery, but also sharing some of your personal experiences and that of the people you've loved. We're now moving to the panel section of this evening. I'd like to welcome Mary O'Hagan, Wellways Director of Lived Experience, who will be facilitating tonight's conversation. I'd also like to welcome Maria Katsonis and Harry Hill up to the stage. Mary has said to me that she wants this to be a conversation, feel a bit more like a fireside chat, and that's what she'll be facilitating. However, we will open the floor to questions about 10 or 15 minutes before we end the discussion. Now, for those joining us in person here, when it comes to question time, please signal to Sophia, who is at the back, might like to wave up, that you have a question for the panel. For our online audience, use the Zoom Q&A function to submit your questions, or vote on the ones that you'd like most answered, and they'll be posed to the panel as well. So with that in mind, Mary, I'm going to hand over to you.
Thank you, Laura. We're going to start with our two panellists are going to give some brief responses to Giancarlo's talk. So who would like to go first?
All right.
Maria, I think you're really wanting to have a go.
Thank you.
She's very keen.
I'm not quite sure how I'm going to follow up, Giancarlo. I'm going to bring out the Greek in me and try and invoke that same kind of passion, I think.
Go on, we've got to be passionate.
Yeah, I'm going to be passionate because I too have lived experience, and anyone who works in lived experience and mental health reform is driven by passion. And I think Giancarlo's passionate plea that puts people at the centre is the antithesis of the kind of system that we have now. And if we're looking at tonight's topic about humanity and dignity, it is not a system that is designed with humanity and dignity at its core. And I think what we need to recognise is the institutional legacy of a system that we're grappling with and trying to change, kind of like a huge steamboat slowly turning around, because that legacy is a system which values efficiency over empathy, that it's a hierarchical system, and you very beautifully spoke about power and how power is not shared, and it's where control and power is vested rather than seen as an asset for everyone. And it's also a system which is built on a biomedical model, and it has its antecedents in a biomedical model, rather than one that is about kind of holistic care and puts the person at the centre. So in the framing of tonight's lecture, the question becomes, how do we, which you started to touch on, how do we shift the system? How do we shift a system that is built on this institutional legacy of control, efficiency, and one built around risk management? And so my thinking around this is this. First of all, it's about taking away the language of cases, taking away the language of protocols, and bringing in ideas around how we support healing. And we have to recognise that healing happens in relationships. It is not just about buildings, it is not just about beds, it's not just about services. Relationships are at the heart of those. So therefore, those who provide care, treatment and support need what I call humane skills, not just skills in clinical protocols, and that extends right across the system, because when we think about a system, we think about a system that spans Commonwealth and state. We think about a system that spans private and public. We think about a system that spans families, that spans supporters, that spans people with lived experience, that spans policy wonks, and I used to be a former policy wonk. So we have to value, and I can tell you sometimes policy wonks don't value presence and empathy as core skills, but that's what we need throughout the system. And I think in thinking about the mental health system, we also need to think about how does it intersect with other systems? What else do we need to be able to thrive? And that's when we bring in ideas such as access to housing, access to education, access to employment, access to justice. And the final comment I make, and this is as a former bureaucrat, because bureaucrats really love to think about what we measure right? What do we measure? What do we measure in the outcomes plan? What do we measure in the strategic plan? And the reality is that we don't measure what matters. We don't measure whether do people feel heard. We don't measure whether people feel respected and safe. And we don't measure whether we know or whether we find out whether people are building meaningful and thriving lives. So if we come back to the basics, if we come back to the institutional foundations of the system, if only we measure what is effective and what is efficiency, again, two favourite words of former bureaucrats, then we're never going to develop humanity and dignity in the system. And as Giancarlo beautifully put it, lived experience is at the centre of fundamentally making that shift.
Thanks, Maria. Fantastic. We'll give her. Now I'd like to pass over to Harry, and you have you've been in a different part of the system, and it would be great to get your reflections on Giancarlo's talk.
Yeah, it was an amazing talk, and it really made me reflect in Maria's follow-up of what I can contribute, to be honest, following in those footsteps. But it made me think of a story, and I guess I can talk a bit about reform in action with regards to a story that I've told a few times now, because a brave person was happy for us to share this story. And it was a story of a lady that really got caught in the system, the old system, as I would say. She had a variety of different diagnoses, and I won't go into them because I don't think they're important for the story. But when she came to our service, she had been attending the area mental health service, so the tertiary level mental health service in our area, many times over the preceding 12 months. I think that on count she had 20 or 30 presentations during that 12-month period to emergency departments, to area mental health officers, and often these were crisis-led, for lack of a better word. That's what was documented in the file, crisis-led presentations. And there was a clear, as we often write, and I think that's the wrong term for it, but a safety plan in the file. And it documented quite clearly that prolonged admissions were not helpful for this person, and that only crisis-level support should be provided for this person. And this person, won't benefit from ongoing case management in the community, and the person was to be discharged from hospital in a timely manner or from ED. And I remember reading this for the first time, and I thought, geez, I'm meant to be a learned psychiatrist, and I'm reading this case plan. What does the person do? Hospital's not good for them. Community's not good for them. They're not for long-term case management. They're in this kind of circle. Where are they to go from here? Where's their escape? Where's their out? Where's their recovery? Where's their hope? And they were referred to our service, and they had a brilliant peer worker that started to work with them. And it became this kind of narrative that you hear so often as a psychiatrist when you're working in area mental health services, where we kind of say, why won't people present more proactively, or kind of don't present in crisis, but present saying they want help or need help. And I often smile when I hear that, because having worked in area mental health services, often when people present in that way, we say, haha, they're not for us, there's no risk concerns, back to the primary mental health care, back to the GP. Yeah. And it creates this kind of circle, and in this person, she was stuck in that circle, because when she presented to ED, or she presented in crisis, she got some form of care. As soon as she was out of that crisis, it was clearly written in the safety plan, ongoing care wasn't beneficial for her, and she was discharged back into a system that wasn't supporting her. And when she started working with our service and she got connected with a peer worker, really started to paint a really different picture for this lady. She had care responsibilities. There was significant violence that was happening in her home. She had housing kind of uncertainty, financial uncertainty. She was eligible for the NDIS, but she had no idea about how to access that support. And when we started to work through that and started to work with her as a person that had comprehensive needs or things that we could do to support, the whole nature of that dynamic completely got tipped on its head. And I remember the first time we started working with her, it was such a different relationship. And I think it's this idea of what's normal to us. If normal isn't necessarily normal, it's what we're used to. And the first time she started working with us, she kind of tested this unconditional love that we were giving her, that we were here to support her regardless of if she was in crisis. And the first few times we started working with her, she presented in crisis because she felt she needed that for support. But when we stepped back from that crisis presentation and said, when you want to work with us, we're here and we're ready, the nature of that dynamic shifted completely. And it's amazing to see this person's growth and recovery journey throughout the last 12 to 18 months, to the point now she's facilitating groups with our service. She's an active kind of role model in community, talking about her story. And it's just amazing to see that dynamic of shift from that risk-driven model to that kind of future-focused recovery empowerment model, and seeing it in action. And, you know, these stories I tell are thanks to my team that works with the person at the centre of everything that they do, which I think is really, really important.
Thank you very much. That's a great story. Yeah. Giancarlo, I was really struck by you talking about that quiet, routine violence that happens in our mental health systems. And it made me think about a concept by Hannah Arendt called The Banality of Evil, when she was talking about a trial of, I think it was Adolf Eichmann, wasn't it? And she went to the trial and she saw a rather ordinary, boring-looking man. And she was struck by how people who do very evil things, he was one of the architects of the Holocaust, people who do very evil things sometimes look terrifyingly normal, they're non-reflective, they're big conformists, they like following rules, and it made me wonder, what are your reflections on how people in the mental health system live with being part of this routine, quiet violence? And, you know, we have the idea of moral injury, that's for the reflective people, but what's your reflection on that, and how can we get past that and create people who are true allies, who will refuse to participate in these kinds of things?
Thanks, Mary. I think part of the answer is in part is implicit in Harry's story. Routine dehumanises because it creates processes, systems, and protocols that sees people not as people but as objects that need to be managed. And so when Harry talked about with his story, he shares this notion that you have to see the person and you have to create the space for them to be seen.
Yeah.
Harry's story demonstrates that. And so when the routine violence doesn't do that, and it sees them as a note to be noted, as a file to be read, you lose that humanity. You lose the opportunity to see that person. And that's the violence. And the annoying thing about this type of violence is its insidious nature. And the nature is of one that you can turn your mind away from. You can close your eyes and pretend you weren't part of the problem. And so when I said unwillingness or unawareness of the violence that's happening in my speech, it's those two choices these clinicians can make. They're either aware or they're unwilling. And there needs to be a responsibility for you to become aware in order to be able to see the people in front of you.
Great. Now, Maria, you want to...
Because I want to pick up kind of the bridge between what you said and what Harry said. Well, I am, literally. In relation to the file and not the person. One of the most confronting things I ever did was request my hospital file after a 5-week stay. And I got 85 pages of notes that were regimented, that never talked about me, Maria, the person who was in there. It was about, you know, I didn't realise I was being observed 7 times a day, with notes about what my affect was, whether I was mingling with other people, whether I was too talkative during group, which I was sometimes, not all the time, whether I was, everything was just so regimented and routine. And I read 82 pages, and this is during my recovery. This was probably at least a year after this particular stay, and I just sat on the floor and wept because I couldn't see myself in that. And that's when I think about, and I was looking at that, well, Not when I was in, you would know, when you're very, very unwell, you have no agency.
No.
You have lost your agency. People are making decisions for you. You have no dignity and you have no humanity. It is the system that holds that for you. And if the system can't exercise that for you with compassion and empathy, then all you are is a manila folder.
But I think you touch on something as well, Maria. Like, it's because in moments of crisis, and I've been in the same situation as you, where we can't exercise agency. I generally believe we always have agency, but we can't exercise agency in these settings. It's precisely in those moments where the system needs to see us as people, and not just 82 pages of fire notes of that questions and write notes down what your affect is for the day or how talkative you are in today's group conversation. It's one of those things that is a cornerstone really of why the system isn't working, because we've created this culture of risk, we've created this culture of bureaucracy that doesn't situate us and our recovery in the community. Harry's story talks about, needing to go to a clinical setting in order to get help. Why are we getting that help there to begin with? Harry talks about this idea of, we want to create the space where this person can come to us when they're not in crisis. That should be in community. Why aren't we doing more of that in community? We're getting better, don't get me wrong. This is happening. But we're not, and I said this in my speech, we're not investing in lived experience leadership. We know what we know as people with lived experience, but we don't have the power, we don't have the control to be able to create models that we know will work because of that risk culture.
Yeah. And Harry, what do you do about the notes? Because, I read my notes too. Yeah. I thought, this isn't about me. I kept on looking at the folder to see if it was the right person. But anyway, so what do we do about this very sort of this awful clinical gaze that psychiatry is very well trained to do? Yeah.
I was fortunate, I think, in the health organisation that I trained in, kind of as an early psychiatrist. We had a clinical director at the time that had the motto, nothing about them without them. And he had this premise that everything that we wrote in the notes had to be kind of fully transparent. And I think that was really helpful. And we had an electronic system before the system got hacked and it got all thrown into the fires, where when we write a note as a psychiatrist, that note would get automatically pulsed out to the person's GP. So it would create this kind of collaborative care network. And I think it kind of ingrained the idea of what do we actually write notes for? It's a tool to be able to communicate to ourselves about what we're doing. It's a tool to be able to communicate to other people in care about what we're doing. And I guess it's a medico-legal kind of cover, but it should also be a tool about how we can communicate with the people that we're working with, and to make sure that their voice is kind of heard. And I think that's when we talk about lived experience leadership and making sure that we have a really lived experience voice in the room. Working in our local where we have a shared model with our lived experience team and our clinical team. And I think if you came to our service, you wouldn't be able to pick who's who. It's not like there's the lived experience department and the psychiatry department. We're all in one room together. It really makes that kind of grounding of the language that we're using and the way that we're thinking, because it centres it at the person. Because, as you said, language allows us to dehumanise things, and we use big medical terms, we use medical phrases, and it allows us to kind of distance ourselves a little bit more from the decisions that we're making and the real people that we're talking about. So I don't think there's an easy answer to it, and AI will probably solve all of it for us.
Well, but you're working in a local. What worries me, you can be kind in a local.
Yep.
It's much easier. When you're in a sort of an emergency room or in an acute inpatient unit, this is where what Giancarlo calls the quiet violence really happens.
So obviously a lot of my work has been, I run CAT teams and other things in metropolitan sites, but what I was listening to when Giancarlo spoke about his other role in Sydney about the health crisis that's happening in New South Wales, and I think one of the things that it's really difficult to distance yourself when you have an enduring relationship with the person with the service, with the environment. One of the easiest ways to distance yourself from something is when you just justify it, I'm just the on-call psychiatrist for the weekend, or I'm just the locum, or I'm just the agency staff member. And I think that with this kind of the funding crisis and the funding shortfalls and other things, we create this kind of very transient workforce. And we know this in other roles. When you're transient, you don't take on as much responsibility for change. So I think kind of focusing on how we can support staff and both lived experience clinical staff as a whole to actually be ingrained and committed to their organisations that they work for. Not for the organisation, but for the people that they serve. And I think that one of the things that we do in our local, but I think it's not just our local, it should be every mental health service, when we're making decisions and other things, it shouldn't be informed by policy. One of the things we always talk about is what's best for the person that we're seeing and how can we help them and what would they want. And then we should actually make sure that our policies and our procedures and our operation manuals actually make that happen, so that we're not making decisions informed by the policy and the operational manual that don't actually help people.
Thanks. I want to get on to broader system issues soon, and I'm very interested in your views on that, Maria. But what I really would love to hear from you, Harry, is how has working with peer workers changed your practice, if at all? What difference has it made?
I think it's fascinating, and I actually haven't looked at the college training guidelines in the last few years, but I'm not that old, so it wasn't that long ago that I was training. But I thought it was really, really fascinating that there is, I don't want to call it a lived experience movement, but there's this huge kind of shift, which is great, of transformation that's happening. But the College of Psychiatrists was a long way behind in that. In the 10 years ago that I trained, over that 5-year period, I don't think I had one lecture or one formal kind of compulsory training thing that I had to do that actually placed the lived experience, the person, at the centre of care, or kind of conceptualised that. There was one module, which I did, which was about care and lived experience that you could do, but it was an optional module. It was kind of like an add-on at the end. It was kind of, if I channel thinking about it as Reconciliation Week, it was like the Indigenous person's model that you could do that was an add-in at the end, but it didn't give it the authenticity that it needed to actually shape, because love it or loathe it, in the current system, and this is, I think, channeling what you said, Giancarlo, psychiatrists are kind of agents for change. We should be key allies to kind of challenge that norm, but if we don't train people how to, what it's about, and we don't have those stories, and I'm an addiction psychiatrist, and I think Rethink Addiction was a prime thing of this, we hear the stories of our supervisors and that apprenticeship model, but how we can kind of bring in the stories of hope, these stories that both of you have told.
I did some, I can't just build on that for a moment, this is going a decade ago, but I was involved in going to training for GPs on mental health, and it was face-to-face, right? It was face-to-face, and we were just, there was a couple of us who did this, I wasn't working, I was a lived experience person with Beyond Blue, at the time part of their ambassador program, and out of the 2 days training that GPs were having on mental health, they said that the most profound impact on them was hearing the personal stories and the interactions with the GPs, not the protocols, the guidelines. It was about the stories, because that's when we see ourselves, sick people, not necessarily as cases. And Harry, you might be interested to know that I think the college has most recently released a lived experience strategy.
They have, I think, and it's a Victorian Simons
I
staff-based
was going to say, so it's come a long way.
It has, it's changing, it's fantastic.
There are those small changes, if you like, that are happening. I've also been involved in terrible training on e-learning modules where I've just seen those woeful pictures of sad. This is Maria. She has depression. How can we help Maria? And I go, in my way, basically. But sometimes we do have other ways to go.
And I guess getting back to your question about how has it changed my practice, I think when I started at the local, was obviously a very new world, and there was nothing to look at because it hasn't really been done before. And I think what shaped, one of the things that I'm really proud about is that we've had 2 models of care that we wanted to make sure our service was accessible, because I think that's the major barrier, and new services, especially in regional areas, they open and within a couple of weeks they're closed. So you're lucky if you get in the front door, but then there's a waiting list that you can never access. So we wanted to make sure our front door always stayed open. But in doing that, we had to be honest, and honest with ourselves, but honest with our community, that we were going to aim to provide good enough care, but we couldn't be the perfect care for everybody ongoing, because then the front door would close. But shock horror, good enough is actually probably better than perfect in most instances if you use this self-determination, self-efficacy model that we're talking about. And people like honesty.
Yeah.
And I think if in having the peers at the front that were honest and actually have buy-in about the service mission and the service goals and kind of express that honestly, I think in the now 3 years that we've been open, I don't think anyone's ever complained, put a complaint in about the service being too short or, not getting the care that they need, because we were honest about what our limitations were right from the front. And I think that's kind of what's been missing a lot in terms of services. There's this kind of idea of people not being honest or authentic about what they're doing. So the other thing that's really shaped my practice is this idea of just how important it is to address people as more than just their symptoms or more than just what's in front of them, but that whole system that's behind. And things like social prescribing, where we actually get people connected with community, connected with peers, growing their self-confidence. You see them grow and thrive. And
Yeah. Actually, on that point, I wanted to jump in a clear value that I see in peer workers working with clinicians is that it's kind of like the bridge between the clinicians and the social determinants that allow that person to thrive and live well in the community. People don't need to be told, I can't access that service because that funded is the funding only covers this. Do you know what I mean? And the envelope only covers that. It's not how humans access services, nor should they access services this way. But peer workers allow for clinicians to do the social prescribing, to do the work of connecting the social determinant dots, so we can be better placed to address the things that are not medical in nature, but are still driving our mental health challenges.
What are your hopes and dreams for the peer workforce in 5 to 10 years? And do you have any concerns about how it's all heading with the peer workforce?
I don't have concerns. I have hope. I shout out to Tim earlier. He does a lot of work in this space as well, we're heading in the right direction. But I want to see peer workers, like I said in my speech, in all settings, not just the mental health settings. I want to see peer workers in settings where anyone can experience mental health distress and mental health challenges. It seems really odd to me that you got to pick your setting to be mentally, challenged. you got to pick your setting, So why aren't there peer workers in the education system? Why aren't there peer workers in the justice system? Why aren't there peer workers in any setting where people experience mental health challenges? It just makes sense. And so when you ask the question, where do I want to see peer workers in the next 5 to 10 years? I want to see peer workers everywhere. I want to see them valued. I want to see them respected. And I want to see them as partners.
Yeah. Great. Giancarlo,
On one thing, because I think you raised a really important word in what you just said, and that is hope.
Yeah.
I think hope is the lifeblood, right, for people who work in mental health, reform and advocacy, because without hope, we lose everything. It is hope that sustains us, the impasses, the blocks, the red tapes, the routine kind of violence, and it kind of spurs us and drives us forward. And the question then becomes, how do we maintain and sustain that hope, both at an individual level, but also at a systems level? Yeah,
and also the hope one we have to have in order to lead our own recovery.
That's
as
right.
well. Yeah. So, Giancarlo, you kind of said in your speech that we cannot have a humane system if we have the use of a Mental Health Act. Is that what you were saying?
Oh, I said we should repeal mental health acts that involuntarily treats and coerces people.
Yeah.
I'm not. Sorry.
How hard is it to be humane when you've got a Mental Health Act?
Look, we really need to see mental health acts do 2 key things. The first is, as I said just then, remove coercive treatment and involuntary treatment. The second is preserve and respect the legal capacity for people to make the decisions that impact their lives. It's all too easy, all too routinely abrogated, that legal capacity. It's all too easy for someone to just say, oh, that person, it's in their best interest, or it's in the interest of the community, that they should be treated by doing this instead. They are robbed of their agency. And so if you can do those two things with mental health laws, then you can create a system for supported decision-making and the ascertainment of what's known as rule and preference in the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. But the thing is, though, these legal changes, they're relatively new. It started off in Peru, funnily enough, out of all places, only in 2019. We're 6 years later. Civil law countries like Peru obviously have a very different legal system to countries like ours, where we have a common law system, and we only have countries like some jurisdictions in Canada and Ireland who have done something novel in the last 2 years. And so all I'm saying is that we need to be brave and start imagining what that future can look like, because it's at the forefront of what that looks like. The world is grappling with that, and Australia, at least in this state, is doing better because you have human rights legislation in place. But in states like mine and New South Wales, where we don't, those mental health acts routinely get misused.
Yeah, Harry, can you imagine a world without compulsory treatment? And what would it look like if you can?
When I think about it, I think often, and I remember when the Royal Commission was happening, I was at a conference, and somebody from, I think, Safer Care Victoria was having a chat, and I think their thing was, how can we reduce restrictive interventions? And all the focus at the time was very much centred around the actual time that the restrictive intervention was happening. And that's really important, but restrictive interventions often come as an outcome of all these things that we didn't do over the I'm not going to say weeks, months, years as a society to be able to help people to change the sequelae of events, to make things more accessible, to make sure that people had their human rights that were being addressed as a community. So in the current landscape, it's kind of like we use the mental health a lot because we don't have the resources put into other aspects of human life. And I think the more resource-limited environments that you go to often, where we don't have access to things, we end up being more restrictive or more medication-focused because there isn't the alternative. It's not about the Mental Health Act, but it's actually about the Severe Substance Dependence Act in Victoria. Yeah. So I'm an addiction psychiatrist, and if I got $1 for every time somebody rang me saying we need to put Giancarlo on the Severe Substance Dependence Act, for whatever it might be. And when you actually sit down and you meet with the person, often you kind of have to hold your breath and say, no, I don't think that's going to be suitable for this person. But let's use this as an opportunity to kind of meet with the person, bring in a meeting, get all the interested parties in and see what we can do to help the person. Often what we find in that is that the person doesn't need to be on the Severe Substance Dependence Act because they actually want help or they want to do something, but there's limits and barriers for that to be achieved. And their housing situation, their financial situation, domestic violence in their relationship, these other drivers are at play, but it creates a conversation to actually make change, and the act is kind of meaningless. The thing that makes that so important is it's so difficult to actually utilise the Severe Substance Dependence Act, whereas in Victoria there's only probably 10 or 20 people a year that are treated under that act. It's not like the Mental Health Act where one psychiatrist can scribble something on a piece of paper, and that's good for 24, 48 hours. And when I locum in New South Wales, I feel really uncomfortable because it's actually harder to treat somebody in the community under the Mental Health Act than it is to treat them in hospital. You have to go before a tribunal to put somebody in a community treatment order, but I can just scribble on a piece of paper and I can keep them in hospital for 28 days. So it's that skewing of so I think the Act and the writing of the Act, it's all very complex, and I think what we do as a community and the interventions we make a difference as well to that end outcome of a world where the Mental Health Act is very different.
Yeah, so I mean, I'm terribly curious. It doesn't really matter what's in a Mental Health Act, as long as it authorises compulsory treatment. The compulsory treatment just goes on and on at similar rates, no matter what's in the Act. But anyway, I want to go over to a more system view. Maria, which your eyes are looking at the ceiling thinking,
I was like, oh no, here I come.
because, I think most of us in this room would say we really need, pretty profound reform in the mental health system. But, if you've been around as long as I have, you know that history, and I'm getting historical, that history is littered with failed reforms. And we are at the sort of aching, maybe end of a reform process in Victoria that seems to have disappeared into delays, rollbacks, and lack of budget support. And as someone who's worked a lot in government, what does it take for governments to follow through with ambitious reforms, or conversely, what so often stops them from completing them?
It's the next new shiny thing that stops them from completing it, if I'm going to be really kind of honest here. I haven't been in government for about 10 years now, but when I was last in government, the big piece I worked on was what came out of the Family Violence Royal Commission. Hot on the agenda, on everyone's agenda, top of the agenda, in what we would call, the authorising environment. And then the shiny new thing became duller and duller, and people realised we can't have, when we're talking about another system here, another complex, slow to turn around system. When we don't have those instant kind of results, it loses its attraction, and the light just shines. The light dims out of the shiny new thing. And then we're distracted. Look, there's another shiny new thing over there. And look, it's another Royal Commission in mental health reform. And let's be clear that at the beginning, here was a reform process that had the highest political authority and mandate. The then Premier and the then Deputy Premier as Minister, very tightly held. And what have we seen over time? We've seen the shine and the mandate and the authority dim, so it's going down like this, coupled against a pretty tough kind of fiscal environment. So what does it need? It needs to be a priority instead of something like, I'm going to be controversial now because I'm not in government anymore, like the suburban rail loop, which is the next shiny new thing, right? So that's where that is. That's where that is now. And over the course of, and I'm on the board of a statutory authority, but I've given notice that I'm not going to be there in 3 months' time, so let me loose. But we've also seen in that time, when I think about the political ownership, right, we have seen 2 premiers, and how many ministers? 3 ministers? 4 ministers. I'm kind of trying to count, and the ownership diminishes over each. So that's one of the things why reform is hard, because we don't stay the course and we don't navigate the difficulties. Instead, we want the quick wins, and so our heads are turned to the next shiny thing. So that's one aspect. The second aspect of it, when we think about system reform, is who owns. Ownership is not the right word, sorry. Who can see the system in its entirety? All of us here on this stage occupy a part of the system. And sometimes we might occupy multiple parts, whether it's the personal part that we play, as an institutional role as I have as a deputy chair or as a CEO, or the individual roles that we have as people with lived experience of mental ill health, or it's the fact that we are in a community setting. I'm in a statutory authority. You're in the clinical setting, and we know our patch, and we see our system through that patch. But who steps back, zooms out, and sees the complexity of this system with its interconnected parts?
Yes, and there's also another sort of dimension to that, which is my next question. Because, Giancarlo, you said the change is already here. The future does not need to wait. What about the ever-present power of history? Because you're talking about the environment and the present, but we also have the power of history and how that juggernaut of a system keeps surviving decade after decade, century after century, that hospital-based juggernaut. And so what's your view about that, and anyone who wants to comment on that?
I would argue, I would argue, it is a juggernaut and it is decade after decade. But incrementally, bit by bit, right? Bit by bit, it is shifting, right? Over that decade. If we're going to go kind of
We don't live long enough to see
we don't,
it.
exactly. We don't live long enough. We don't live long enough to see it. And what propels the juggernaut forward? It is the hope that people have for system reform and for keep driving through and for keeping to persevere, right? It is about perseverance and it is about a kind of resilience.
Yes.
That it's like, sorry, I just finished rewatching for season 1 of The Handmaid's Tale because it's just finished, right? I'm going to go back. Don't let the bastards grind you down, said Offred, right? That's what she said, the Latin. Don't let the bastards grind you down. And that's what I know. At an individual level, I have to hold when I have to deal with the impasses, and we can't do this because of the rules, or we can't do that because of the rules, and you just inch forward. Sometimes you just need to smash it, and sometimes, try to do that. But it's a combination of the both. Yes. And sometimes it is also about the alliances we forge collectively. It's not just about the individual power, it is about that collective power of a movement. And given your history, Mary, if you go back, I'm not saying you're old, but if you go back, but no, if we were, I'm old too, I'm grandma, but if we go back, I'm not, but if you go back 30 years ago, even to when I started in mental health advocacy, for me, it was around about 2008, I can see those kind of changes.
Yeah, I see changes too. What worries me, and I'd really like your comments on this, Giancarlo, but you're not as old as I am, look, there's been a lot of changes. We've got peer workforce, we've got leadership, we've got a few more crumbs of community services, and so on. I do not see any evidence that the life and health outcomes for people who actually use services are getting any better, and nobody actually really measures it. And that's what really matters to me, and that's what saps my hope when I think it's not getting any better. And it'd be really good to get people's comments on that.
I'll touch on on that last point in a second, Mary, but I wanted to respond to Maria's comments. Before my role at Being, I led policy and advocacy at the National Peak Body for People with Disability Australia. And over the 6 years I was with them, we actually learnt to use history in our favour. And we did, and I said this in my speech where I said we needed to embed co-design not as a buzzword but as a structural imperative, and that was done through alliance, like Maria said. We worked with all the relevant peaks, which there were many, and involved a lot of stakeholders. But what we did, and all we can, was to prosecute the very simple message: you cannot do this. Nothing about us without us. And that set the history. That set the convention. That convention made ministers and undid ministers. That portfolio still remains as one of the biggest political hot potatoes that anyone doesn't want to have on cabinet. And that's because we are still grappling with what does co-design mean. People with disability know what that means, but it's the government who isn't fulfilling that promise. And so I would say, in the mental health system, we need something similar. We need something where we can use history to our advantage and say, well, why would you not want to co-design with us? Why would you not want to co-produce us? You've been doing this the last 6 years. Why are you changing it all of a sudden? It's really hard to work backwards when you've locked in that convention. That's the beauty about conventions. So you can use history to your favour is my first point in response to that. On the point of data, I think this is where I get a bit nerdy. I sit on the Australian Government's National Disability Data Asset Council, and I think there's a huge role for people with lived experience to play in understanding what data sets we need to be able to understand our own lived experiences. Those data sets are owned by data custodians, governments primarily, but they don't do anything for, they're not framed for us. They don't answer the questions that we want to answer. Like, I couldn't tell you how many Cow people with disability are non-binary, and has mental health conditions. I couldn't, but I want to know that. And so how could I possibly know that if and advocate for evidence-based, data-driven policy reform without that? So people with lived experience have a role to play in understanding what data is collected about us, how that data is interpreted, how that data is then applied, and then how that data is then used to be able to refine services that we access.
Absolutely, yeah.
Can I just touch
Yeah,
on a little?
yes.
If we even go beyond the data at kind of a population level, but one of the interesting things that's happening in our service at the moment is that kind of quality measure, is what we're doing, providing quality outcomes that you said, so we can share that. And it's really interesting. So, often it's not a great measure, but state-funded services are literally just contact hours is often how they're measured. And, how many hours did somebody write on a piece of paper that they spent with somebody? And then when they bring in these quality measures, often these measures are kind of clinical quality measures and then we establish peer workforces that are doing really meaningful work, and then we're asking a peer worker to use a clinical tool to validate their outcomes of and I think we've got a duty to kind of reflect that that's not fit for purpose, and that we shouldn't try to, put a round hole through a square peg, and that it's our duty then to actually say, well, we value what we're doing. How can we create a quality measure that validates the human experience and validates the delivery of work that the peer work is doing? Yeah. And I think Wellways is doing some work on that, which is a really exciting project. But I think if we want to demonstrate the work that we're doing, we've got to have the tools that back that up.
Now, I'm getting the nod over here from Jess to say it's time to open up the questions to the audience. So would you like to organise that, Jess?
Yeah, so we've got a question here, so pass the roaming marker. Hi, thanks for the panel discussion. Okay, where do I start with this? This is more a challenge rather than a question that I want to raise. At one point during the discussion...
Can you put the...
Yes, at one point during the discussion, we were given the... and I mean, overall, the panel is asking us to reflect on history. There's a lot of talk about history and how we are at a point in history. And Hannah Arendt's notion of the complicity of the silence was mentioned, and we were asked to think about the silence, the violence that the mental health, the harm that the mental health system does to the silence of the Holocaust. This is more a comment and a challenge rather than a question, because we were invited more to reflect, which is what I'm doing. So I'm reflecting on this, and I fail to see the appropriateness and the usefulness of the comparison of saying that the harm that mental health system does, and it does that. I'm a lived experience mental health advocate myself, so I do appreciate, value, and acknowledge that the mental health system does quite a lot of harm. There is historical violence within a lot of the system that intersects with the mental health system. For example, for our Aboriginal communities, among many others. So I do understand why we are invited to think about violence within the system. But I wonder if it is appropriate and if it is meaningful to draw that comparison, especially because we keep talking about history tonight. We are at a point in history where there is actual violence war going on in the world, and the mental health of people on all sides are affected.
Yeah, yeah.
So I guess, yeah, this is more a comment that I want to make about whether we should be more careful about drawing those comparisons. And another point that I want to mention, actually.
Can I respond to that point?
Of course.
My apologies. It was a slightly overdrawn point in some ways, and my apologies if that caused anyone in the audience any offence.
It just made me, if I'm honest, extremely uncomfortable when Hannah Arendt and Holocaust was mentioned, to draw comparison to the harm that the mental health system does. So I guess by making this point, I want to challenge and encourage all of us to be more careful about the language that we use when we talk. And I do get the point, because we are passionate advocates. We want to make sure that the system is reformed and all of that. But I think the language that we use could have very diametrically different effects of how much we include other people or exclude other people. And all the talk about humanity, dignity, design, and then the Holocaust was thrown in there. My brain just went into override. But thank you for the discussion.
Thank you. We might go to some online audience questions, as the online audience are really keen to engage as well.
We've had some great questions actually come through online. There's a lot of engagement. This question has been directed to Maria. So I'll read this out one to you. So how could, this is from Chris Groot. So how could the yet to be published National Stigma and Discrimination Reduction Strategy inform human rights-based reform in the mental health system?
Oh, this is a Dorothy Dixer, but I'm very happy to talk about it, because this is my, and with Chris and a number of others, our a very unhappy relationship with the Commonwealth in relation to mental health, and where there has been no dignity and where there has been no humanity in mental health policy design. For 2 years, a group, including Tim Heffernan in the audience, mental health lived experience advocates, worked with the Commonwealth to develop a stigma reduction strategy, recognising that stigma, whether it's structural, whether it's in systems or whether it's in self, is preventing people from accessing care, treatment and support. It was submitted to government and it sat there for a year. Until one day we all received a 5-line email from the department that said, "Dear Maria, just a quick update. Your strategy the Minister has referred, this is what it said, the Minister has asked that we consider actions from your strategy, and we would like to thank you for your involvement." And I speak government, and I can tell you that consider means bloody F all. It means we're going to think about it. 2 years of work, we're going to think about it. So for me, that experience was disenfranchising. It was dismissive. I was treated contemptuously as a person with lived experience, and it was the antithesis of the kind of co-design that Giancarlo has been advocating. And it's how we don't work with people with lived experience and treat them like commodities.
Right. Further questions? Yeah.
Hi, everyone. Firstly, thank you so much. John Carlo, you delivered a fabulous speech. The panel's been great. I've just got a question, and I think it is a challenge for all of us in the work that we do. Harry, you said earlier that lived experience and clinicians shouldn't be transient and they should be ingrained in their organisations. I'm just wondering how, which I agree with, but how difficult and what a challenge that is when most services that are being delivered are bound by funding.
It is a real challenge, and if I put
Yeah.
my addiction psychiatrist hat on, one of the hardest things is mental health's actually a lot more fortunate than AOD in terms
Yeah.
of the certainty of funding.
Yeah.
For those that work in the AOD sector, majority of the jobs are these 12-month rolling funding applications where you get your 12 months and then you beg, borrow and steal and you might get another 12 months, which makes it really difficult to kind of commit. I think often though, we have the person that's accessing the service at the centre of what we do. But I think coming to working in partnership with Wellways or Wodcock Health and AXO and kind of being around some champions of kind of people and culture, who are here in the room today, one of the things that's made our local successful was some of those early champions of our service that kind of said, if we're going to help others, we need to make sure that we help ourselves first, and really encouraging, people to bring their whole selves to work and kind of engage people in valuing what they can contribute. And it is achievable. If I use the analogy of where I come from in Wangaratta, our area mental health service, one of the CCT teams in the area mental health service has about 15 FTE funded, and I think they have one regular staff member. All the rest are relying on agency and other staff. At our local, we've got about 35 FTE. We've been 98%, 100% recruited essentially for 3 years. I think we've had 2 staff members that have turned over. One of them got a peer role and got promoted to a local partnership, and another one became a nurse practitioner and took on a new role. So how we can kind of value kind of those roles and sustain people, because then that has roll on. And I think this is one of the challenges, I think, with peer work, and it's one of the things that's coming up in our team, is there needs to be viable career growth for people where they don't kind of come in and feel like they get stuck. And it's sad, but it's true. Like, one of the reflections that we've seen in our team is that people then often go on and do, because they feel like there's a ceiling with what they can make as a peer worker or what they can do, they go and become social workers. Or they go on, and you shouldn't have to become a clinician to be able to grow in your career. And I think this is a challenge kind of what society values, and I think often still there's this kind of value that's placed on degrees rather than the value of what the person can actually, just the value of what they can bring to an organisation in terms of the change impact they can make with participants and their peers.
Thank you.
Hi. What a great talk. It's been a mind-blowing talk, and I'm certainly that it's changed a lot of people's view and how they're going to go forward with what you have spoken, all 4 of you today. You at the later part of your talk, you spoke about peer workers, and you spoke about clinical staff, and you also spoke about data collection. And you said that the data that's always been collected is connected always to clinical outcomes, and the peer workers don't have an opportunity to have a say in what data can be collected to show their work performance, if you like, through data collection. I think that is a very important point that was raised, and I just want to throw the question to you, because you've obviously thought about this for a while to raise it. I want to throw a question to you, as in how can you see this change happening? How can we collect data to gauge peer worker performance through our data collection system?
So obviously, I think we need to go through it about in an appropriate way and those bigger picture kind of thinkings around research and actually proving what we're doing. But I think if I think about it as a core principles kind of level, I think so much about the markers that we use for outcomes at the moment are kind of centred around kind of symptom reduction. You know, has your anxiety reduced? Has your depression reduced? You know, I think what I'm seeing in the local and what the outcome is, sometimes people's anxiety doesn't go down. Sometimes their mood doesn't improve that much. But they can still have really significant improvements in their quality of life and their function. And I think those markers that kind of measure that around, you know, yes, we all live with anxiety to some degree, and we all learn how to manage that. But those kind of functional markers that kind of measure how safe people feel in their home, how safe they feel in their relationships, how confident they feel in integrating with community, how supported they feel in their networks, those functional markers are really, really important. And I think that would be the thing that we're keen to explore, of shifting away from kind of symptom reduction models to kind of functional enhancement. The other thing of that first point, when we're kind of integrating kind of, and it kind of channels with some of the, when, you know, and I feel this as a clinician often in different environments where I'm in peer environments, is often when I first started doing this work, you can feel like you're under attack at some points, you know, from the legacy of what's come before. And sometimes you feel like, and I completely get this, why people make polarising kind of statements about others. But that's because of the inequality of the past that's there. And, you know, I've seen that in the way that we run our team. We used to have, when it was first badged when I came, it was a clinical review meeting. But I mean, 90% of our staff are peer workers. So why have a clinical review meeting? You know, it doesn't make sense kind of to have. So we shifted that name to a participant planning session. And then it used to be chaired by a clinician because that was just the norm. And, you know, I was guilty of that. We kind of roll in and it's a clinician that writes the notes. It's a clinician that chairs it. But even though it's an equal voice meeting, it has to be chaired by a peer, because that is how we kind of normalise that equilibrium that's been skewed to the clinicians for too long, if that makes sense. So I think sometimes we have to go too far to come back to some degree, and not be challenged by the narrative. You know, I don't take it to heart when sometimes people, you know, I get why people say that.
2 points if I could just pick up on that, because we've talked about history, but there's the history of language as well, and that we don't challenge language, just like you have, which I think is fundamentally important, even kind of clinical services versus care, treatment and support. What's inherent in each of those in relation to a holistic care about the person versus the file and the manila folder. The second thing that I just want to make sure that we don't forget when I think about the system and when I think about lived experience in the system, and you just mentioned it, Harry, very briefly at the beginning, is about in relation to research. Right, so that there has to be also a lived experience lens in any kind of research that's undertaken when it comes to thinking about and finding new models of care, treatment and support as well. So that lived experience has to span all of those aspects.
You made me smile, because one of the things we did in our local is we wanted to publish some of the work that we're doing. And I remember the first time we published, we wrote to an academic journal, and one of the things that they often do is, where's your degree? What's your degree? And I wanted the lived experience. I didn't want it to be just Dr. Harry Hill writing for the journal. So we got the whole team together and we had that lived experience. And I remember literally, and there's people in this room that were involved, writing to the editor kind of saying, no, there are no degrees and that's okay. You know, and not to put all the degrees on the paper, because that creates this kind of unequal, you know, it shouldn't define the outcomes.
That's right, and that's another example about where power is held in the system and in the system of research as well, and how that needs to be challenged just in that particular way.
And even the way grant applications
work
exactly.
exactly.
HRC.
We need to wrap up, and I think Giancarlo wants to say the last word.
No, I'd rather have someone ask another question, but
we can stay here all night.
I'll come up to you afterwards, but if there's another space for another question, I'm happy to.
I think
Otherwise, I will go on.
We've got to wrap up. So, any last word, Giancarlo?
Well, just on the
before we
research
finish?
point, I think I wanted to just draw a few concepts together. Like when you asked the question about like how do we measure what peer workers do, that's one step removed. We need to be able to think about, Maria touches on it, we need the research agenda to drive how we understand what models of care look like, right? And at the moment, that's not really happening. It's driven by clinicians primarily. And so what we need to do is be able to have people lived experience setting the research agenda, articulating the questions that are being asked about people and their lived experience, and then interpreting and applying and evaluating the data that comes from that research. That is a key aspect of understanding how the model that is being developed through the research becomes an aspect. And that's exactly what we did with the National Disability Data Asset National Disability Data Asset. For those who don't know, it's a world first data asset that will hopefully bring all Australian governments together to drive data-driven decision-making and policy-making settings. And the very first thing that we did as a council was said, we don't know what the research agenda is. We created a National Disability Research Partnership, and we went back to community and we said, what do you want to research about? And we gave them the power, we gave them the control, we gave them the ability to say, what do you need to research? And we're in that stage now, and by taking that approach, we can then start to understand what data assets, what data sets, what questions, what models can start to look like from the lived experience perspective. So I hope that answers your question.
Fantastic. And I would just like us to all thank our wonderful panel.
Wonderful panel and wonderful facilitator, Mary. Thank you very much. I've been asked to think about one thing I could take away from this evening to kind of wrap up, which is a really hard thing to do, by the way. Thank you, the four of you. So I've written down some words about what my experience has been. I've been impressed, in awe of the passion of the people up here on the stage. And that's important, I think, when we're in this reform kind of area. I've laughed. Maria, Giancarlo, you are terribly theatrical and entertaining, so thank you. I've nearly cried at times. You talked about your loved ones, Giancarlo. I've got pretty angry as well. I've got angry because the sorts of services that Harry speaks about, that he's been involved in a team with Wellways and other organisations, and I've got angry because the state government isn't committing to reform in the way we expected and they promised. There is roads to be built and tunnels to be opened. Seems to be taking priority. Thank you, Maria, for that perspective. I've got excited a little bit as well. But the word that came up that I have to take away was hope. Maria, you used hope. Mary, you often talk about hope. And hope that we've all got a role to play in designing and being part of a more humane system. And perhaps it's in the little things we do, as well as the big things we do, as players in the system that can help make it a more humane system and a better experience for people. And Maria, you talked about the incremental change, giving us a bit of hope. I started my career in those large psychiatric hospitals on the outskirts of Melbourne, no longer on the outskirts of Melbourne, but were at the time. And we have come away from there, and I think we need to keep on pushing to make that incremental change. And perhaps it's only if we push that we're going to make that change happen. So thank you so much for your contribution and your personal investment in coming to participate in this lecture. I think the silence in the room, the excitement in the room, and the questions indicate how well it's been received. So thank you so much.